Hello, welcome to the part 12 of the Facts About Our Country program series. Today, our guest is Mr. Fernand de Varennes, former UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues. Mr. Varennes, welcome to our program. Mr. Varennes is an academic working on the rights of minorities, ethnicity, and democracy. And Varennes is a leading figure in the field of human rights with more than 250 publications translated into more than 30 languages worldwide. And de Varennes was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council as the UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues, where he served from 2017 to 2023. And Mr. de Varennes visited our region, Western Thrace, in March 2019 and had the opportunity to get to know our region and our community. And today we will talk with Dr. de Varennes about the issues of national minorities in Europe and the latest developments regarding the Turkish community in Western Thrace. Dr. de Varennes, first of all, thank you for accepting our invitation and welcome to our program.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And let's start with the first question. We would like to touch upon the concept of national minority. Who are those that are labeled as a national or ethnic minority?
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, the question is actually a little bit complicated because the concept of national minority is especially used in Europe. But at the United Nations, we actually refer mainly to ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. Linguistic minorities, well, clearly Turkish-speaking people in Greece, for example, are members of a linguistic minority, and ethnicity is connected to culture. So at the same time, for example, the Turkish minority in Greece would be considered for the UN system as an ethnic, linguistic, and we could say also members of a religious minority.
And is being defined as a member of national minority a condition for the protection under the international human rights law?
Absolutely not. For example, even if a government denies that a minority exists, for example, at the United Nations, it's clear that objectively you can still have an ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities. And the concept of a national minority, sometimes in Europe, it's connected with citizenship. Let me be very clear. At the level of the United Nations, at the international level, even citizenship is not a requirement. An ethnic, religious, or linguistic minority is objectively other people who share the same ethnicity, culture, religion, or language. Are they less than half the population of the country? And the answer is yes to these. They're a minority for the purposes of protection under the international UN system.
And as members of the national minorities in Europe, we know that 1 in 7 European citizens belong to an autochthonous national minority or speak a regional minority language. And what is the situation in Europe in terms of respect for the rights of national minorities?
I think unfortunately, we are seeing, I would say, a regression, a movement backwards. Just recently, the European Court of Human Rights issued a judgment a few months ago, last September, which essentially allowed the government of Latvia to close down, to prevent education in the Russian language, both in public and private schools. And unfortunately, the European Court did not really look at European treaties such as the Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities. The European Court used a concept which is called margin of appreciation, which essentially allows it to prefer the reasoning of the government. So unfortunately, in some areas, national minorities are seeing movement backwards in the recognition of their rights because of the weak European mechanism, very clearly. Now, I want to say this is in relation to national minorities and European mechanisms. It's not true in the case of international UN system. The UN system would not allow the approach used by the European Court. At the United Nations level, minority rights are human rights, and so therefore we afford to minorities, I think, a stronger protection, perhaps surprisingly, to what is happening in Europe with the European mechanisms.
And could you please also give some positive and negative examples from Europe?
Well, we are seeing, for example, that there is strong practices for the protection of ethnic, linguistic, and we could say national minorities with the German-speaking minority in Italy. For, in the last 10 or 20 years, the Italian government has adopted, I think, a series of laws that actually accept the diversity in Italy, including the linguistic and ethnic diversity, much better. I think, therefore, if you look at practices such as in Italy, one could say generally in Switzerland, increasingly in the United Kingdom with minorities such as the Welsh-speaking minority and the Gaelic-speaking minorities, I think there's also progress there. So there are some progress in a number of European countries. It's just that the European mechanism, which are supposed to actually protect national minorities more, especially in the area of language, are, well, in practice, they are sometimes being ignored too often. And I must say, we see this especially in countries in Eastern and Central Europe, but also, I have to admit, in France, which has always denied that minorities exist in that country.
Yeah. And you also visited our region, Western Thrace, in 2019 for the conference on educational rights of the Turkish community. And we know that you witnessed the speeches by the representatives of the Turkish community in Western Thrace during the UN Forum on Minority Issues for many years. And based on your first-hand experience and observations, where do you see Greece in the field of protection of minority rights?
Well, I'll try to be diplomatic and say simply that Greece could do a lot more. There are two areas that I think we have clearly a lot of improvement to make. The area of education in the Turkish language. This has not, to my knowledge, has not improved in recent years. The issue also of the choice of religious leaders within the Muslim community, Turkish Muslim community in Greece also needs to be addressed more strongly. And if I can make one suggestion, I think it is normal and useful to use the European mechanisms to try to protect members of the Turkish minority as a national minority. But you should also consider the United Nations mechanisms a bit more. The problem is, of course, that in Europe, the Greek government has been reluctant to adopt or to accept these European treaties. And therefore, I think you will have to go in terms of the international protection of the rights of the Turkish community in order to perhaps make some kind of progress eventually.
Yeah. What recommendations would you give to the Greek authorities for the protection of the national minorities, not solely the Turkish community in Western Thrace, as a general protection within the Greek territories?
I think what I would recommend strongly is to understand that minorities that are treated well will actually behave as very productive and positive citizens of a country. And in order to also protect Greek minorities outside of Greece, it is also important to keep in mind that the minorities inside of Greece must also be well treated. So I think it is important for the Greek government to move away, I think, from certain fears that protecting minorities could be a way of weakening the country. History and many practices around the world show it's the opposite. If you treat minorities well, they will be actually happy and productive citizens in the country. And so I would strongly urge the Greek government to look again at the approach of human rights and the rights of minorities in a positive frame of mind, and to see it not as a threat to national unity, but as a way to ensure that national unity is maintained with all members of society, including minorities, seen as equal and respected members of the Greek nation.
Yeah. For the last year, since there was elections in Greece, we also witnessed the prejudices and the biased treatment against the Turkish community during the Greek elections. This actually is what you are saying now. And what would you be your recommendation to the Turkish minority in order to break the prejudices and in order to have an attitude from the Greek government in order to prove that we are not threats to national unity or public orders? We know that the Turkish community representatives have a long struggle to have the attitude which actually they deserve from the Greek government. But what would be your recommendation to the community itself?
Yeah, thank you very much. I actually would invite the members of the community to look at European institutions a lot more. What's happening, or what you describe in Greece, is not only happening in Greece. We are seeing in a number of European countries a rise of intolerance and prejudice against minorities, but especially even in a political context. We are seeing some politicians using nationalism, the nationalism of the majoritarian nationalism, and blaming or pointing the finger at minorities as somehow a threat. This is called in English scapegoating, and it's very common to scapegoat a minority as somehow dangerous or stranger, outsiders inside a country. I think it's important for the members of the Turkish community, for example, to lobby European institutions in order to increase pressure, I think, on the Council of Europe, but also the European Union, so the European Parliament, and they have special committees at the European Parliament, and the elected members of the European Parliament can raise questions. It's important that politically, members of the Turkish community and others really try to defend democracy and ask for European institutions to defend democracy, but a democracy that is inclusive and accepts the diversity of the state equally, all members of society, every community within the state, and that they realize the danger of these, let's call them political activists or politicians who are trying to blame and scapegoat minorities, especially during elections. I do not think that the European Parliament and the European institutions recognize this sufficiently. I think it is a threat to the European Union and the Council of Europe, and it obviously is a threat for minorities in Greece and otherwise. It is important to work with European institutions to make your voices heard, be more visible, lobby, and try to make changes within the European institutions. And if I can take just one more moment, I would say it's important for members of the Turkish community to work with different minority alliances, networks that do exist to protect the rights of minorities in Europe. There is the Federalist Union of European Nationalities. There is the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization. And we're attempting to create a global alliance of minorities also to lobby the United Nations and other regional institutions. And I would invite you to actually consider also being more visible and active inside of these organizations if you've not also already done so.
Yeah, this is actually exactly what ABTTF is trying to do for many years, but we know that it's not so easy, but it's a long path that national minorities should consider. And what would you would like to say as a last word?
Well, I think there are positive examples. If you consider, and this may sound like a strange example, but if you consider how indigenous peoples have become more effective in lobbying and being visible and present, for example, at United Nations in the last 20 to 30 years, I think there's a model for minorities in Europe also to do something similar, to actually become much more visible and effective in your lobbying, perhaps, and having minority issues become important and prominent within the institutions of the EU and the Council of Europe. So it's possible. It takes a lot of effort, but I think we have examples of success Sometimes it may take 20 years, maybe a bit more, but I think this is the kind of vision that you need to make the situation change. And by the way, we have to change the way minorities are treated in Europe and in the world right now, because it's an extremely difficult period right now, extremely antagonistic, almost against minorities. But it is during these times that we actually have to redouble efforts to make sure that we actually can progress.
Okay. We will all together redouble our efforts for the protection of the rights of national minorities. And this comes to the conclusion of our program. And Dr. de Varennes, thank you very much for accepting our request and for being our guest today. And as we all have often stated in this program series, actually, we would like to create an open platform to discuss the rights of national minorities at the national and the European level. Of course, we have a much more focus on the Turkish community in Western Thrace, but we would like to create an open dialogue and the chances for the issues that which are hard to talk about, actually. And that's why we would like to thank you once again for the sincere opinions and suggestions to the national government and to the Turkish community itself. And we will be here with a new guest in the next program. And thank you very much again for being our guest today. Thanks.
Thank you again for having me. Best of luck in all your efforts. And remember, you're not alone. If there any way I can help, please do not hesitate. Merci and have a nice day.
Thanks.